query. So if we go through these comments, so the first thing we want to do is look in the URL and check if we have an athlete ID. So how would we do that? Yep, so we've got an if. And what do we want to check in that if statement?
If it's set.
So we can check is set or not empty. So if we have an athlete ID in the URL, then we're editing. Right? If we have no ID, then we don't have to really do anything. We can just show the user the blank form. So all of this code, I'm going to put inside a set of curly braces. We don't need any variables, and we don't have to connect or do anything unless we have an ID in the URL. Now, most of you had this part, so we stuck the ID in a variable. What did you call your variable?
ID.
You could call it ID, or more descriptive would be athlete ID because it matches the key from our query string, plus it matches the column in the database. So if we have an ID value in the URL, if that value is set, stick it in a, store it into a local variable. The connection line is the same as always. Right? Now I put this in an if because if we don't have an ID, there's no need for us to connect to the database on this page. We'll just give the user an empty form, so we don't have to waste a connection. So we'll connect and turn on debugging. And looking around at most people's code, most of you had the right SQL command. What is our SQL going to look like? So we'll select star, we'll select all the columns from athletes where where our athlete ID is equal to, we'll use a bound parameter, which we can set up as an integer, just like on our delete page, right? We've already done this on our delete page, same kind of where clause. And then we'll prepare a command, we'll bind the parameter and execute the query exactly the same way. And it would help if I spelled it properly. So we'll prepare a command. We'll pass in our variable and we'll set it as an integer. So we'll execute our query and we'll store the results. So rather than getting all of the athletes, we're only getting one record based on the ID number. So what we want to do now is go through our query result. We only should have one record here. Yeah, and we'll just basically store each value into a local variable. There are a few different ways to do this. I'm just going to use the same loop we've been using. Do we really need a loop? Is there a way to do it without it? Yes.
First index can be 0, because it's only one row.
Could be, but I'm going to use a loop anyway. It'll just loop around one time. So I'll create 3 local variables. So I'll create a variable called first name. How do I get the result of the first name out of my database query? Yeah, I'll just use my row array the exact same way we do on our athletes page. We don't have to invent something different. This is how we've output the first name, last name, and emails here. Instead of outputting them directly to the page, we'll put them into variables. We'll do the same with all 3. I don't need to put athlete ID into a variable. It's already in a variable from up here. We've just populated it from our URL on the very second line of code. So we'll run our query. We'll loop through our single result. And now we have variables that hold the first name, last name, and email. Once we do this, we can disconnect. We don't need our database connection anymore. All we needed to do was pull out those 3 values.
Can I see the big segment?
Sure. So we're saying this is set function means does this have any value or is it null? So if it's null, is set will return false. If it's true, is set will return true.
Do variable scopes not matter in PHP?
They do, but they only matter if we break our code into methods and functions. If our code is linear, is procedural from top to bottom, then the variables are global in the page. Okay, it's a good question. So we can use the variables, populate them up here, and then we can inject them down here into our form. If I'd written this as a method or function and put the variables inside, then they wouldn't be available outside. But because our code is procedural, any variable we use, like athlete ID or first name, is available anywhere on the rest of the page. Okay, does that make sense? It's a very good question. Thanks for raising that issue. So this gives us, let us retrieve the first name, last name, and email from the database. Does anybody else, are there any other questions about what's going on here? Notice also I've opened my curly brace here, and I've closed it right down here. So all of this code, all of this code is only happening if we have an athlete ID in the URL, if that value has been set. If we don't have one, we don't need to connect, we don't need to run a query because we're not looking up an existing record. We're going to add a new record instead so our form can be blank. So now we've got these variables, first name, last name, email. How can we use these variables so the user gets a page that's populated rather than a page that's already blank?
We gotta say that?
Yeah, well, not yet. So here's we still have to show them the form.
Okay, you put a PHP tag in value.
Okay, so inside of our value where it says something here, I'm going to replace that with opening and closing PHP tags. And how do we print out the first name?
Echo first name.
So we can use an echo command. So this is kind of the opposite of what we've been doing. Usually we've been putting HTML inside of our PHP blocks, right? That's what we did on our athletes page. We have a PHP command and we've been adding HTML tags inside. Now we're doing the opposite. We have an HTML tag, and we're injecting a PHP variable into our HTML tag. So we can do either. So what will we need to do for the last name and email? Yeah, we'll just do the same thing. So in our last name value, we'll open PHP tags and echo the last name. In the email, we'll echo the email. And what about this last input? We talked about it before the break.
Replace something here with hidden and the value with athlete ID.
Right, so we want to make the type hidden. So it's part of our form, the ID will get sent to the server along with any changes to first name, last name, or email. But we don't want that to be a regular text box. We want it to be hidden from the user. And we'll echo our athlete ID in here. So we're still going to post to save athlete, but now that page is going to have to get modified because it might add a new record, it might update an existing record, we don't know. We'll want it to do both. So I'm going to upload my file to the server. We'll try it out, we'll see what happens. So now if I click on edit, I get my form and it's queried the database and pulled up the first name, last name, and email for that selected athlete. I click edit beside somebody else and I get those values as well. And if we look at the source of the page, we can see here's our hidden box. There's our hidden value that has the correct ID number. So we're going to need this ID number on our save page. Does anybody have any questions about how we're putting this page together? What's happening with your page, Daniel?
Oh, it's just not populating in the names, first names and last names, and it's not filling it into the form.
Are you using echo?
Yes.
Or are you just putting?
Again, I'm not reading it properly.
And make sure you're populating your athlete ID parameter from the get value. Do you have a question?
What happens if we try and insert it from tag field now?
Sorry?
What happens if we don't try and update, but rather try and insert a field?
Well, our insert's still going to work, right? What we're going to do is we're going to take our save page from week 2, because all that's working. It already connects to the database. It already runs an insert. So we're going to copy that page from our lesson 2 folder to our lesson 5, but we're going to need to modify it to put in an if statement, because right now, every time we call the save page, it does an insert. We're going to want to modify that code so it might do an insert or it will do an update.
So we just do is
Hang on one second.
The reason why I'm asking is because when I didn't check is set get, I got an error. Like I had to check is set get and is set get athlete ID.
On your save page? Well, what we can check on our save page, So here are the values that are going to get sent to save. We've got first name, last name, email. There's something else missing from here.
Name?
What we need to do is give our hidden input a name. So what would be a good descriptive name for that box? Yeah, we should call it athlete ID to match the column. So John, I'll let you answer your own question maybe. How are we going to know on the save whether we're doing an insert or an update? What could we check that will tell us? Not meaning to put you on the spot. Right, what we will check is whether post athlete ID is empty or not empty. Okay, so if we have an athlete ID, if it's not empty, what function do we want to run? If we have an athlete ID when we save, are we inserting or updating? Yeah, we're updating an existing record. If we don't have an athlete ID, we're inserting.
What I was asking was what literally happened when you loaded the insert without an update get. So get would be undefined.
So if I load it without the get, then I will get a blank form. Right? If I don't pass in anything, my form is blank. Okay, my value for athlete ID is empty. So now we can evaluate. I just have to upload my file because my file is missing the name equals athlete ID attribute. So basically now this form is dual purpose. If there's no athlete ID, our form's blank, which means our next page will insert a new record. So I have to re-upload and make sure that this athlete ID attribute gets included on my form. So if I refresh, if I have no ID, my athlete ID is blank. But if I want to edit somebody, I get that record. So now my form can perform both functions, adding or editing. Okay. Are there any other questions about our page or what we're doing here? If you want to ask, now's a good time to ask, because if there's no question, I'm going to move on to the save page. If there's any other code here you want me to scroll up or down, just let me know.
Can you go to, oh,
Right here?
Mine doesn't update. It's just
Well, we haven't written the code to update yet. So if it's not updating, is it just inserting? It's inserting every time because the save page is it's hard-coded, it always does the insert. So what we want to do, I'm going to take a copy of the save page from week 2, I'm going to copy it into my lesson 5 folder, and then we'll add some code to it. Okay, if you don't have the file, you can grab it out of the week 2 zip on Blackboard. If you
just one line we have to change?
no, we've got to add a few lines. Nope, you'll see, we're going to have to do a little bit more than just that. So I'm going to go into my lesson 2 folder. I'm going to grab the save page and copy it. So I'll copy it into my lesson 5 folder. So here's what our page does so far. We're storing the 3 inputs and variables. We're connecting to the database. We're setting up an insert command. We pass in the 3 parameters. We call execute. And we're just printing a message to the screen. So now we might have 3 variables being passed, but we actually might have 4, right? If we're updating, we also have an athlete ID. So the first thing we want to do is we want to include an athlete ID variable. So if the user picked edit, we'll have that ID value in our hidden text field. If the user didn't click edit, then our athlete ID value is going to be empty, which is fine. We shouldn't have one if they're adding a new record. So now we're going to connect as usual, but we're going to have to make some changes here. This insert statement is still correct, but we don't always want it to run. Yeah, we need an update statement as well. And how are we, so we're going to need an if statement, right? We're going to need 2 different SQL commands and an if statement that will determine whether we're running insert or, as you said, whether we're running update. So I'm just going to change that to say SQL command. Won't necessarily be insert. So what condition are we going to check so that we know whether we're doing insert or update? We'll say if something, right, else something else. So how can we check whether we're doing insert or update?
If not empty or if is set.
Yep, okay.
Athlete ID.
So if is set, we could use empty or is set. So if our athlete ID variable is set, are we doing an insert or update if we have an athlete ID? Yeah, we'll be doing an update. So I'm going to move this part. Actually, I'll put this comment up above. So if our athlete ID is set, we'll do an update, and if not, we'll do an insert. So we'll still use our same parameters. What needs to go on the end of our update statement?
Where athlete ID.
Yeah, we need a where clause, otherwise we're going to update every record in the table. Not a good idea.
Do you need to bind it?
Yep, we will, but we'll only want to bind it if we're doing an update, right? We don't want to bind. If we try and bind it when we do insert, we're going to get an error because there's no parameter in the insert called athlete ID. So if we have an ID, we want to run this. If we have no ID, we want to run that.
Why do you have to bind it? It's a hidden value, isn't it?
Technically, you don't have to. It's still just good practice. Any values that you're passing to an SQL command to put in bound parameters. Because also, right, I could do this.
Yeah, then,
Right? So we don't really want that. It's always safer to use bound parameters, so you should get in the habit of using them. So before we execute, we're always going to fill the first name, last name, email parameters. Now we need this if statement repeated. So if we're doing update, we're going to want to bind the athlete ID as well. So I'll just copy that line So before we execute, so add athlete ID parameter if we are updating. So if our athlete ID is set, we want to add that parameter as well. We only need to do this for an update. We don't want to do it. In fact, we'll get an error if we try and bind that parameter with the insert, because our insert has no parameter called athlete ID. I know it seems not efficient to write the same condition twice, but we need to do it this way because we have to set up the SQL first to prepare the command, and then we need a separate check. The last thing we should add on here is right now all that happens is we're printing a save message to the screen. What should we do that would be better for the user after we save? Yeah, let's take them back to the athletes page, so if they added, they'll see the new record. If they updated, they'll see the changes. Right, so I'll take that out. So I'll redirect to the updated athletes page using header location. And because we're using that redirection, we're also going to need at the top OB start and at the bottom OB flush, or else we're going to get that error that I showed you that says your headers were already sent and the page will crash. So I'll add that redirection. At the very bottom, I'll put in PHP tags with OB flush. And at the very top on line 1, I'll add OB start, output buffer start. So this page should be able to still do inserts, and now it should also do updates for us. So I'm going to put in my password and try it out. Then I have a question for you about how we're handling the update. So when I upload my page now, if I go in and change a record, I'll just put in a 1 after everything and hit save. All my fields got updated. If yours doesn't work, it's a good idea to comment out the redirection because if there's an error being printed, we're not seeing the error because we're redirecting. So if your page isn't working, I would temporarily put in a comment here, save your page and try again so we can see any error message. Now we should probably check we didn't break the insert. We can see the updates working, but is insert working if I go back to athlete? So now if I get a blank form and I want to insert a new record, okay, so something's gone wrong. We broke insert. So now we need to figure out what we did wrong. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take out my redirection. temporarily. I better put my password back in. And I'll re-upload my save page. It's interesting, we didn't get an error. So it looks like I think we might want to change something in this condition. I have an idea.
Not empty, because my guess is that it is detecting that it is defined, but it's empty.
So so our other option is to use empty. Yep, so we'll
use a set post of athlete ID.
well, there will still be a value. It will be an empty string because even on the add page now, we still always have that field.
Okay.
So maybe we'll change is set to if athlete ID is not empty. I think that's a good suggestion. We'll try that and see if that makes the
Then you have
difference.
to change it at the finding as well.
Yep, and now we'll do the same here. We'll try that and see if that makes a difference. Yep, that seems to make the difference. So instead of using is set, we'll use empty instead. Okay, so I'll use not empty, both here and here.
How is it different?
I think if it's set, if it's an empty string, it's considered to be set, but it's not considered to be empty. Sorry, it's considered empty but set. An empty string is not, is not a null. So is set,
Is set checks undefined as empty, checks void, null.
right. So empty is a broader check.
Okay.
So we need to use that. So now I can put my redirection back in. So I should be able to go back to athlete and add one more. So I can add and I can edit. My changes are there. The other thing we could do on our athletes page to make this easier is we might want to add a link at the top that says add, so the user can go there easily. So I'm just going to open up my athletes page for a minute. And inside the body tag, before my PHP, I'm just going to add on a link to athlete.php, just a standard HTML link that says add new athlete. And on my athlete.php page, up at the top, inside the body before my form, I'm going to add a link here that says, that goes to athletes.php, and it'll say list athletes. So now we have links that go back and forth between the pages so the user can navigate around. We'll look in a few weeks at making a common shared navigation bar. We'll do that after reading week. So if we try it now, I can jump back and forth. And now I can edit or delete. So we basically have a full mini working application now. We can do whatever we want with the data. We can view all the data in our database. We can edit any record. We can delete any record. We can add to it. Now, one question I have about the editing. Notice whenever I edit, so if I go in here, if I only change the last name field, our SQL command is still going to update the first name and email even though they haven't been changed. We don't have to do it this way, but I recommend doing updates is easier this way. Why would it be a good idea to update all of the fields even if some of the fields haven't been changed and some have? You don't have to do it this way, but I'd suggest it's a good idea. Why?
It saves a lot of code.
Right. If our form's really big, if we only wanted to update the fields that got changed, we need to keep track one field at a time, and we'd have to compare each value. Is the old first name the same as the new first name? And if it is, include first name in our SQL command. It's a lot of work to track that. The easiest thing is simply to update all of the fields. So even though I didn't change the first name, we'll still update it anyway. Now, very occasionally, in all the years I've been building web applications, I think I've only had 2 scenarios where a client said to me, we need to know which fields the user was changing. One of them was because it was tracking equipment, and the equipment was insured. So if somebody changed something on the piece of equipment, my client needed an email that would show them which fields were changed, because they would have to call their insurance company and tell them specifically what parts of that equipment got changed. For example, if the cost of it had been changed. One of my other clients, the website was a directory. So they would, a directory of business addresses and phone numbers. So every year they'd print a new directory, so the editors wanted to see what had been changed. So they wanted me to be able to show last year's listing, and here was this year's listing beside each other, and they wanted me to highlight in yellow any changes. So we had to keep track. It's a lot of extra code, so unless it's absolutely required, the easiest thing is just update all of the fields.
I was also going to mention that it includes a lot of string hacking, because you have to hack up the strings for the update column.
Absolutely. So it would make writing our update commands really messy. The only other thing I'm going to add to my page to finish our application is we have no styling on our form. We added the CSS to our athletes page. We didn't add it to our form. We can very quickly and easily do that. So I'm just going to go into my athletes page. I'll grab those 2 links from the header. And inside of the head section, I'm going to paste in those links. And I'm going to add a few classes to my form. So I'm going to apply a couple of classes for formatting. In here, I'm going to add, in my form tag, I'm going to set the form class to form horizontal. We'll see how that looks. At least it's using my CSS. That's probably sufficient for now. Could we make it look better? Sure we could. But at least it's got the same look, and it's got a link back to our main page. So we basically have a fully working web application that does create, does read, does update, does delete. Okay. This is just a mini version. You know, so in this web application, all it is, if we look in the site control panel, there's the ability to add, edit, and delete news items, add, edit, delete courses, add, edit, delete content, add, edit, delete page templates. That's the whole thing. We're just repeating this with different tables. So everything we've done in our little application here should allow us to build out bigger applications that use multiple tables. To all just create, read, update, and delete with a little bit of CSS attached to it.